G'day, my name's Simon Ellis. I'm a livestock and pasture consultant working through the high rainfall areas of South Australia. Today we're going to look at how to set up a containment area for managing your livestock through dry summers. As we walk down here, why did you pick this one?
Far enough away from the house not to be smelly, easy to get to with the tractor in and out, bit of shade, but not too many trees.
Yeah. This paddock is probably twice as big as it needs to be, maybe even 3 times as big as it needs to be. So if I were looking to make this better, I would bring a fence, so this side of the watercourse, so maybe from the trough, or just a bit to the right of the trough, down, and just having the tree on that side of the fence. But then of course that means that in the afternoon, or after a while in the afternoon, there's not going to be enough shade, so you'd need another tree or shade area. But that would protect that little bit of watercourse there. And you'd still have plenty of room here for 30 cows. Would be an absolute doddle. You've saved the rest of the property from getting overgrazed. So you know, one area gets really hammered, but the rest of the property is saved, and that almost always is a better option. You don't get the tracking. Have you noticed how by the break of the season there is tracking all over the place? Right? So if you keep them contained to a small area, you get damage there, but you don't get the tracking elsewhere. Have you driven past a property where when things get tough, the gates get opened? And that's the absolute worst thing you can do, because not only do they overgraze, but they also then have tracks through gates, and it just makes it even worse. If you're going to use confinement areas, make the decision, make the call early. You can always let them out back into the paddocks later on if you find that you were a bit too conservative, but once the feed's gone, it's gone. It is a good thing just to let the board and the EPA know that you're planning to do this. There'll be no problems, but just let them know so that they know what's going on. That's when you want to stop grazing, when there's not much feed left, but the bare patches haven't started to develop. There's no point waiting till it gets to there. That's just way too long. So setting up the area doesn't have to be expensive. You need good but not fantastic fencing. I think what we'll see is just standard fencing works perfectly well. And because there's nothing outside the paddock, they're not putting the same pressure on them, and animals aren't stupid. They know that they're going to be fed. So as long as you feed them enough, that the pressure on the fencing is not ridiculous. That said, you can get some individual rogues, and oft times it's worth culling those animals because they not only do they get out, but they'll teach bad habits to the others. You need shade. Animals clearly need shade. Pines in particular are quite good because they're a bit harder for the animals to ring bark, and they're also not so sensitive to high fertility. You know, when you've got a small paddock with lots of animals, you actually build up the fertility very nicely, and that's not always what the native plants like. You need good water. Obviously don't put it so it's right beside a watercourse, or don't put it beside your next door neighbours. And it's best, if not essential, but best if it can be reasonably accessible to your feed and stock handling facilities and so on. John, this is the area where you do the containment management. Do you want to just explain how you set it up and what you do?
Yeah, well, first of all, we chose this site mainly because it's out of sight. There's just enough of a hill there that no one can see it from the road. It's also as far away as possible from any of our water courses. We've got a big dam down there, 60 megalitre dam, so that's the nearest area, but that's about 400 metres. So, but just given the constraints of it, we've only got a 180 acre property here, so given the constraints of the property, that's as far away from any water courses as we can get. And it's not a bad little spot as far as the layout of the property goes, because we can use it as a bit of race, run between paddocks out there and down here, and it's a handy spot just to run sheep in occasionally to get them out of the way. As I said before, we built it in 2006 in that really bad drought year. And this is our boundary fence here, so that was here, so it was just a matter of fence, about 400 metres of fencing altogether. The way we use it, we have a pen of sheep in here and the pen of sheep in there. Last year we had 400 in each pen. Can I just hold you there? You can see that, so for 400 sheep, those troughs were adequate, weren't they?
Yes. Yes.
So you don't need a huge trough for 400 sheep. People think that they need those, 10 metre long troughs, and it's not so. No. And with the grain feeding, you can't just drive into a group of sheep in a small area with a trailer, because you run over half of them before you get it fed out. So we lock them in there. I back up from that gate down there and then spread the grain full length of this smaller area here. And then we let one lot of sheep have access to this one day, and then we chase them back in. And then the next time we feed grain, we spread it out again and let the other lot in. So they have alternate days at the grain. What we did last year, we put a big heap of grape mark out there, and I just put it over the fence with the front end loader as much as they wanted to eat.
3 to 4% slope, so just a bit of a slope, so that any water can run off without going at a ridiculous rate. And you can see there, that's pretty standard fencing, and it's held those animals perfectly well. That's the same paddock, incidentally, after about 6 months later after the opening rains. So paddocks aren't necessarily ruined by one use as a sacrifice paddock. You can see there's clover and perennial grass really come back nicely, and the fertility was terrific. You don't have to use expensive materials. One thing that is good, can you see there? See the 2 electric wires? You'll get the dominant animals, usually the dominant female, will walk right down the centre of a trail of feed. Putting a portable electric system up like that just stops that happening. So you can see where the animals have trodden on that. That's what do you call it? A conveyor belt, an old conveyor belt that's been just lifted up. So again, nice and cheap. But if you get cows walking on that sort of stuff, they'll break whatever you've done. It'll be more easily broken if they're walking down the middle of it. How many of you have got a hay ring? Yeah. So that can be used easily as well. Hay rings in the paddock I'm not such a big fan of, because how you get that sort of damage around the outside. But in a sacrifice area, it doesn't matter at all. Water, that's one of those movable troughs. So you nothing has to be expensive, And when you've finished with it, you can take that out if needs be. Well, as I said, shade's essential, but you really do have to protect trees. You can see one of the offenders over there, and that paddock had, I reckon about a dozen mature gums, and all but one have died as a result of not giving protections. Permanent's best. I know that's going to be expensive, but if you set up an area when there's only 3 trees to protect, not such a big deal. There is actually a whole lot of chicken wire there that used to be down here, and animals, again, when they're really wanting to get to something, can, and they've actually just pushed that chicken wire up. So if you're going to do it, make sure you do it properly. Stock density, for cattle, we're talking here, about 25 square metres per cattle beast. So if you've got 20 cows, you're talking about, a tiny area. You don't need a big area to contain animals. You need to allow about 5 square metres per sheep. So if you've got 50 ewes, that's 0.03 of a hectare. It's tiny. You really don't need big areas. In fact, one of the things that I find when people are initially setting up is they want to provide too big an area for the animals. Small is good. Don't mix different classes of stock. So if you've got heifers or this year's calves and pregnant cows, so you don't want weaner sheep in with pregnant ewes, because they have different dominance in terms of who gets most of the feed, and they also have different feed needs. You can often use existing paddocks, and sometimes you can even use existing yards. So if your yards are big enough, there's no problem with having a containment area in the yards, because that's almost certainly going to have water and facilities around it. So when you're looking at what you're going to keep, breeders are the key. So you really want to hang on to your breeders. Get rid of any that you've sort of been thinking, she's sort of, do I really want to keep her? Do I not? Before you go into this system, make the call and get rid of anything that's not really what you want to keep in the long term. You also want to keep your good young stock, because they're the best genetics on the farm usually if you're self-replacing, so you don't want to be getting rid of them. And lastly, you want to separate as well as into class. If you can, it's good to separate into fat and thin, because the thin girls need more feed than the fat ones. So you can save feed if you can do that. If you can't, that's okay, but you'll need to then feed to the thin animals, which means the fat ones will get more than they need. One of the things that people often say, it's going to be too expensive to set up a confinement area, but animals looking for food spend a lot of their life walking. What do we do if we want to lose weight? Animals can spend a lot of energy walking around paddocks constantly looking for that extra morsel of food. If you've got them confined in a small area, that stops. So there's actually a more efficient use of the feed that you give them. It's like anything, the first time you do it, you do have to, ask people who have done it. Call people like myself. There are people out there who can help you through the first time. And once you've done it once, really, I won't say it's a doddle, but it's certainly not as demanding as you might think.